Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, Henri Bergson on evolution. That's what we're looking at today. Alright, let's just get straight into it. The main point, I think, in this video and the main idea kind of running underneath all of Bergson's thought on, not just on evolution, but pretty much on everything, is this idea that the whole is what's important first. The whole is what we have to consider first and foremost. That's where all of the action happens, at the level of the whole, not at the level of the parts that make up the whole. If you try and understand the whole by looking at the parts, you end up distorting the picture. You end up, sure, you can reproduce the whole by putting the pieces, the individual parts together in a certain way. But that's not how the whole operates. That's not what the whole is. And that's what philosophy is for Bergson. It's an understanding of the whole over and above the sum of its parts. And that's what we're dealing with in evolution. So all the parts of an organism and the parts of organs are first and foremost elements in a whole, elements in a totality. And that's how we have to think, that's how we have to look at them in order to understand them, is as a whole first. Sure, we can break it down later if we want to dissect or analyze the components, if we want to perhaps manipulate them or control something or alter them. Yeah, then we need the parts and we have to look at the level of the parts. That's what science does. But if we're doing philosophy and we're trying to understand the whole, that's the level of our analysis. That's where we have to direct our attention. So we have to understand the organism as a whole. We have to understand the organs that are doing the jobs that they're doing as wholes. And this is obviously important for evolution. And this is like I was kind of hinting at, the exact opposite view to that of science, which sees organisms and organs as first and foremost collections of parts. So it's the parts that are important for science. That's what, and then there's nothing more going on here. If you just put the parts together in this certain way, then you get the whole kind of for free. The whole emerges, if you like, from the workings of the parts. But the parts are where all of the action happens. It's the exact opposite for Bergson. You can't understand, you can't explain the whole by looking at the parts. So there's I guess we can summarize that position. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But that's the idea, I think, driving underneath or underlying everything that Bergson has to say about, like I said, evolution and also everything else. Okay, so there are three alternatives that Bergson considers in this part of creative evolution. The first is Darwinian adaptation by accidental variation. Okay, so we all know what Darwinian adaptation is. We all know natural selection. I don't think we need an explanation of that. But the problem with it for Bergson is that any accidental change to one part of an organ will disrupt the functioning of the whole thing. And the example that he uses is the eye. And this might set off warning bells for anyone who's used to defending evolution against like intelligent design proponents who argue, the eye is so complex, it can't have evolved naturally. It has to be a creator. But Bergson's argument is not that, well, it's so complex we have to look to some kind of divine intervener. Rather, he's saying the eye is complex, but all of the parts of that eye work together in harmony. and they have to work together in harmony. And if you just pluck one out and drop something different in its place, you get disharmony. You don't get, by changing one thing, you don't get an improvement. You can't get an improvement. That's Bergson's main point here. Just changing one thing, which is which is the whole Darwinian evolution project, right? It's the idea underlying the whole theory. Just changing these individual parts. If you just do that enough, if you just run the experiment enough times, eventually you'll get a change which yields a competitive advantage. And Bergson's saying, you do get that. You do get a change which yields a competitive advantage, but not through just this changing isolated parts of an organ. Because changing a single part will disrupt the whole thing. The way I think about this, it's not an example Bergson uses, but just when I was preparing for this video, I thought of thinking of imagining a machine that is working, right? Because every organ is functioning. Sure, every organ can function better, but every organ is a functioning system. So think of a machine. We've got a machine that's doing a job, and it's doing it fine. It's doing it well. Could it be faster? Sure. Could it be more efficient? Of course. But it's working now. Now, if we just, let's say, randomly decide to replace a cog, let's say. So we've got a small cog doing the job. Let's put a bigger cog in. Well, obviously, it's not going to work. You can't just throw a bigger cog in the place of a small cog and expect the machine to work. It won't work. You have to adjust everything around that cog, right? So there's enough space for it to work. And perhaps that change will necessitate a change somewhere else, or else the new cog won't work. You'll have to have different fixtures, different fittings, perhaps, to accommodate this cog of a different size. So just changing a single thing doesn't improve the performance of that machine. If we want to improve the performance, we have to change not just one thing, we have to change a whole host of things. And not just things local to the part that we change, but you might have to change things further away as well. Maybe the process somewhere else. If it's especially if it's run by computers or something, then you'll have to change the way that the application processes certain information. Maybe that'll have to happen at the same time as the change is made as the local change is made to the machine. And it's the same thing with an organ. Just changing one thing, it's not going to improve the performance, because the machine, the organ, was already honed to perform well. It's not that it's performing perfectly. Of course, you can always improve things, but you can't improve it. You can't improve the operation of a machine that's working well, or an organ that's functioning well, by just changing one isolated thing. You'll always have to change more than one thing. And that's what Bergson says doesn't work here. Darwinian adaptation doesn't take account of that. And that's why he disagrees with it. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. I think I've explained that enough. So the mistake then for Bergson here, according to Bergson in Darwin's model, is that it treats each organ individually, as if it's not related, as if it's not a coordinated part of a whole. Treats each organ separately. So you can just change this organ without having to worry about anything else, without having to change anything anywhere else in the organism. And the same thing with if we think at the level of organs, you can just change one part of an organ, but you don't have to change anything else. Just changing that one part, and the organ's not only going to continue to perform, it's going to function better. That's the claim. And the mistake, like I said, is that we're treating each of these things, an organ in the case of the organism, or a part of the organ in the case of the organ, individually, without thinking about the whole. We're treating the parts as if they have no relation to the whole, as if we can just chop and change anything, anywhere, and still get a functioning organ or a functioning organism. And so to overcome this, Bergson says that Darwin was aware of this problem, and so he opted for what he calls insensible variations. And so in this modification, the changes, each change, each adaptation is so slight that it doesn't disrupt the function of the organ, the functioning of the organ. But of course, the problem with this, and the objection that Bergson raises, is then the changes are so small. If the changes are so small that they don't hinder the functioning of the organ, then they also can't improve it. It's impossible to get a competitive advantage if your changes are so small that they're no longer having a discernible impact. And the other option then to overcome this problem is sudden variation, which is where everything that you need to change changes at once. But this is implausible for Bergson, and I agree. Is that a surprise? I agree with Bergson that all of the parts of an organ that you need to change in order to accommodate this one change that will yield a competitive advantage, it's unlikely that that's ever going to happen, let alone multiple times. So that's the first alternative. The second alternative is adaptation due to the external conditions. And by this, Bergson means that the environment acts directly on organs. So organs are basically forms adapting themselves to the mold of the environment. So the environment's kind of shaping the organs. And this would be fine if we were talking about a purely mechanical change on matter as a result of direct physical imprint on it from the environment. But that's not what we're talking about. And the example that Bergson gives is like a pigment spot. This can change through exposure to light. This can adapt. You can get variations purely from the influence of the external environment, the light hitting it. And it's that light hitting it which drives the change. That's fine. I mean, that's a direct result of external conditions. But organs, and again, thinking about the eye is an instrument involving a nervous system, a muscular system, a skeletal system. It's working in harmony, in tandem with all of these other systems. It's not just one thing that, the environment can alter independently. We have to consider it as part of this whole. And because that's what it is, first and foremost. The eye is not a standalone organ. It is a part of this whole, this organism that is functioning, that is performing a job. And so it's really the same objection. You can't have the external environment affecting just isolated, solitary organs. There has to be a greater change going on, a more inclusive, holistic change if you want evolution. And finally, the third alternative is Lamarckism. And so this is the heritability of physical characteristics acquired in the lifetime of the organism. And so this is related then to the effort of the individual to adapt itself to its circumstances. And this could be just mechanical, so it could just be the organs themselves without, any just changing kind of on their own in response to the conditions, or it could be it could involve the will. So the organism creating a new habit, through force of will, and then that habit is being passed on to its offspring. So anyway, you've got this notion of the heritability of physical characteristics of habits acquired in the lifetime of the organism. And the problem with this, I don't think anyone seriously takes Lamarckism seriously these days. But the problem for Bergson is that any evidence in favor of this can be better explained through genetics. So the idea of natural selection, the whole genes being passed on to the offspring, competitive advantage, all of these kinds of things explain what Lamarckism seems to explain. They explain it better than that. So Bergson dismisses that as well. So anyway, we've got these three theories: Darwinian adaptation, an adaptation due to external conditions, and Lamarckism, which Bergson rejects. So what's Bergson's account? What is his creative evolution, his creative brand of evolution? Well, first, he takes all of these three alternatives and agrees with parts of them. So starting off with Darwin, he agrees with Darwinian natural selection. The idea that change comes about through mutation, through variation, and those changes are controlled by genes, and those genes can be passed on to the offspring. That's all fine. But he rejects the idea that the variations are accidental. So he rejects the mechanism behind the pure mechanistic approach of Darwinian adaptation. With the second alternative, he agrees that there is adaptation in definite directions in response to the environment. He just, again, rejects the idea that these are mere mechanical environmental forces driving the change, that it's just the circumstance, the environment in which the organism lives that is driving evolution. And he also agrees with Lamarck that will or some kind of effort is involved. We talked about Lamarckism in terms of being related to the effort of the individual to adapt itself in some way. So whether that effort shows as purely mechanical in organs, or whether that effort is more conscious in a willed sense. So he agrees with Lamarck that will is involved. He just rejects that it's the will of the individual. And this gives us a hint of where we're going. He's got a bolder idea of life and evolution that allows for this something will-like, something effort-like in kind of reality fundamentally, in life itself. So evolution, then, according to Bergson, kind of a definition. I'll give this one to you. Evolution is an original impetus of life passing from one generation of germs to the following generation of germs through the developed organisms which bridge the interval between the generations. Okay, cool. So that original impetus of life, we'll talk about that more in the next video. But evolution is that impetus working its way through unfolding in and through individual organisms, generation by generation, being passed on from one generation to the next. The next thing I want to look at is a distinction Bergson draws between function and structure. So he looks at, if we look at organs, the function of organs considered as a whole, each organ considered as a whole, is simple. There's the function of the eye is to see, to provide vision for the individual, for the organism that possesses it. But the structure, however, is complex. Not just complex, but infinitely complex. We can continually drill down deeper and deeper and get more and more levels of complexity, at each level. So we can start with the different parts that make up the organ. There are many of these parts all working together in harmony, and then we can perhaps go a little bit deeper to an analysis of the atomic elements that make up these parts. More complexity, more moving pieces. Go down a little bit further, the subatomic, however far down you want to go, at each point there's increasing complexity. So in essence, there's an infinite amount of complexity in the structure. And what's important about this realization that there is this dichotomy, this distinction between a simple function and a complex structure, this tells us that one is real and the other is the product of the intellect. And this is a theme running all through Bergson. We've talked about it so many times in so many different places. A simple whole is the truth. That's the in most cases what we're talking about metaphysics, the metaphysical reality. The complex parts, the complex interplay of the parts that make up that whole, that's it's not an illusion, but it doesn't give you an accurate picture of the whole. And kind of the evidence for that is that you can just continue to chop up the whole into different parts. And once you've got those parts, you can chop those parts up into parts. And more parts into parts, and it goes on forever. So you've got infinite complexity. And there can't be infinite complexity in life. If you have to wait for an infinite number of things to happen, if you have to wait for the coordination of an infinite number of components, you'll never get the whole in the first place, right? So what's true, what's real is the simple, the whole. That's the function of the organ. And what's not, like I say, not it's not an illusion, but it is kind of illusory. The illusory picture of it is the breakdown, the infinitely complex structure. And the example, Bergson has a couple of examples to back this up. The first is imitating a painting. So if you are going to copy a painting, one way to do it would be to break it up into little squares and just color, copy. The square is green, we'll just do a little green square over here, the square is yellow, and so on and so forth. And the more squares you break the painting up into, the better reproduction of the painting you'll be able to come up with. But again, there's an infinite regress there. You can always chop it up into smaller squares to get a better picture, and you'll always only approximate the original. That's the important thing. The original painting achieved that perfection, achieved that infinite complexity. And at every time you drill down to a smaller square, you're getting closer to that original perfection. But you're never going to get there, obviously. You can always break a square down into smaller squares. So you're always approaching the original, the whole, but you're never fully getting there. However, then we have a problem, because the painter originally produced that infinite complexity. How did they do it? They didn't do it by breaking up and painting up, by breaking up the canvas into a whole bunch of squares and then painting each square, coloring each square. They did it through a single stroke of the brush. In that single stroke, they produced this, what appears through the intellect, infinitely complex structure. And so, by analogy, the painting is life. And when we look at it, though, through the eyes of the intellect, all we see are the details. All we see are the parts that make up life. We don't see the broad stroke. But that's where the truth is. And when we only see the details, when we only see those little squares that make up life, there are only two possibilities to explain it. And the first is the mechanistic hypothesis. So just assuming that the little parts, by placing the action in the parts themselves. So the parts interact in such a way that the outcome is this picture, this life. Or you can imagine a plan. Maybe there was a goal in mind, and this then gives you finalism. So there's a desired outcome prior to the process of life, to evolution, and it's just fulfilling that, just tracing the path that's already been set for it. But in neither case should we have got at the real process, for there are no squares brought together. It is the picture, i.e. the simple act projected on the canvas, which by the mere fact of entering into our perception is decomposed before our eyes into thousands and thousands of little squares, which present, as recomposed, a wonderful arrangement. So the eye, with its marvellous complexity of structure, may be only the simple act of vision, divided for us into a mosaic of cells, whose order seems marvellous to us because we have conceived the whole as an assemblage. Great. I love that. There are no squares brought together. There are no squares. They only appear when we view the painting from the perspective of the intellect, which can only work by breaking things down. And if you go in that direction, you're moving further away from the truth at every step, because the truth is up in the whole. Cool. The other example that Bergson gives is, and I've talked about this before as well, the movement of my hand. When you move your hand through the air, you're moving through an infinite succession of positions. And this is kind of Zeno's paradox as well. But there's more in the movement itself. There's more in the movement considered as a whole than just the succession of positions. Because the movement makes the whole infinity at once. The movement traverses this infinite number of spaces at once. And so that means that the whole is real, right? The movement is real. It must be. And what's illusory, what's not in the sense that it's not real, but in the sense that it's not the truth. It's a breakdown of the truth. It's like a model constructed to understand the truth, but it's always a deficient model. It can only see all of these individual positions that the hand moves through. So the hand is the movement of the hand is more than the succession of positions, because it makes the whole infinity of those positions appear at once, but it's also less than the succession of positions, because that infinite sequence of steps can only be realized by both the assemblage, the parts, the steps, and the intellect. So it requires kind of two things in order to explain the movement, whereas the movement itself is just one, a simple act. So I quite like that. It's more than the succession of positions, because it creates this entire infinite number of things in a single stroke, but it's less than that same succession, because the succession requires the component pieces put together and the intellect to see it in that way. Kind of a nice way to think about it. So it's the same thing with the eye then. There is in vision more than the component cells of the eye and their mutual coordination. In this sense, neither mechanism nor finalism go far enough. But in another sense, mechanism and finalism both go too far, for they attribute to nature the most formidable of the labours of Hercules, in holding that she has exalted to the simple act of vision an infinity of infinitely complex elements, whereas nature has had no more trouble in making an eye than I have in lifting my hand. Nature's simple act has divided itself automatically into an infinity of elements, which are then found to be coordinated to one idea, just as the movement of my hand has dropped an infinity of points, which are then found to satisfy one equation. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. That quote just nails it. But this whole thing, this whole understanding of evolution that Bergson has, is difficult to see because we mistake organization for manufacturing. And that's the next dichotomy I want to look at. So in organization and manufacturing, manufacturing takes the parts first and then involves assembling them together. Organization, however, takes the simplicity of the whole first. And once you've got that simplicity, that simple whole, you can break it down into parts. But it's the whole that's prior. So it's really like just repetition of that same theme that I started with. Right? We have to think of organisms and organs as wholes first, rather than components of parts. So that's the distinction Bergson's making here: organization versus manufacturing. And this is a really great analogy. He talks about a hand moving through iron filings. So when it moves through, you can imagine all of the iron filings are displaced because of the hand. And if we imagine now the hand to be invisible, so you've got this, all you're seeing are the filings being displaced. You're not seeing the hand itself. And so what happens then, this is how we see life. The mechanists see the filings move and look to explain the movement through the only thing that they can see, which are the filings. So they imagine forces operating between the filings. This filing has this particular property, and that causes this filing over here to do this, and so on and so forth. And through an ingenious endeavor, which is physics, you can explain how these things work, all without reference to the hand, which is actually moving through the filings themselves. So you can explain all of the filings being displaced solely by the postulation of forces operating between the individual filings. Finalists, on the other hand, see a plan governing the individual movements of the individual filings. So they see there's a goal in mind, and that's what's making these filings move the way that they are. But both interpretations see something positive in the filings themselves. That's where they look for their explanation, i.e. matter. That's what science looks for. It looks for the only thing that it can see, which is matter. And it sees that it's moving in certain ways, and it tries to understand how that movement is happening. But all it has to focus on is the matter itself, the filings themselves. But in truth, matter is a negation. It's the resistance of the vital impulse, which is the only positive force. It's the resistance to that invisible hand which is moving through the filings. The filings aren't doing anything. No individual filing is doing anything. It's reacting, well, it's being displaced by the only positive force, which is the invisible hand moving through it. And that's Bergson's idea. Life is this invisible force moving through, progressing through individual organisms. All we see are the organisms moving. All we see are the organs changing. And we seek to explain this change with reference to the individual things themselves, the matter that we see. But that's missing the fundamental truth, the deeper truth, which is that there is this hand, this invisible hand moving through, which is causing the change. Unless you realize that, you might have really an incredibly successful theory about how these things work, and it may work it may be able to explain any kind of physical occurrence, which is what we have with our physical theories. But even though they work, they're missing the fundamental truth, because the only positive force in life is this vital impulse. All matter does here is it preserves the trace of what has happened without being responsible for any of it. I love that idea. Matter is just preserving what's happened. It's just showing, it's the remnants of the actual cause, or the actual positive force, the only actual active force, which is life itself, which is the invisible hand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, matter versus the vital impulse, in the next video. Okay, summary. So first we looked at some standard accounts of evolution. We looked at Darwinian adaptation, then an adaptation in response to the external environment, and to Lamarckism. We found problems with all three of those, which I won't go through again, but none of those worked for Bergson. Bergson's account, however, starts with this notion that we have to think about the wholes first and consider the parts only later. The parts are secondary. It's the whole where all of the action happens. So he agrees with parts of all three of those prior accounts of evolution that we looked at. He agrees with Darwin's account of natural selection. He agrees with adaptation in different directions, in definite directions in response to the environment, and he sees an effort. He sees Lamarckian effort coming through, just not an effort at the level of the individual. So life, or evolution rather, is an original impetus proceeding through generations via organisms. And that was kind of our definition. We also looked at this important distinction between structure and function, and that really, again, this idea that is behind all of Bergson's philosophy. If the function is simple in the whole and the structure is complex in the parts, then this indicates that the latter involves an interpretation of the intellect. and we have to look to the former if we want to understand the thing in its completeness. And the examples that we saw there were imitating a painting, the movement of the hand, and the eye itself, the function of the eye versus the complexity of the structure of the cells that make it up. And finally, we looked at this organization versus manufacturing distinction, where the latter involves an assemblage of component parts, whereas the former starts from the simplicity of the whole. And the great example, and a really classic example from Bergson's philosophy, is the invisible hand moving through iron filings. That really captures, I think, especially Bergson's take on life. So that's a good one to keep in mind. And that is everything I wanted to say about evolution. Hopefully that made some kind of sense. And I will see you in the next video where we'll talk about the vital impulse. So until then.